All right, welcome back to Grimerica Outlawed. We have Ben Davidson with us, the sun weather man. He's got this YouTube channel, the famous YouTube channel, Space Weather News. Talks about astrophysics, geophysics, and space weather. He's made a textbook, Weatherman Guide to the Sun, on X. He's x.com, Sun Weatherman, and of course, over Observer Ranch as well.com is another website. So thanks for joining us, Ben. How you doing?
Pleasure to be here, guys.
I just looked back to when we had you on at first. It was 10 and a half years ago.
Wow.
So, I mean, before we got into anything, any of the current stuff, like, man, well, actually, we did have you on in 2019, I think, as well. So, I mean, it's not like we haven't seen you for that long, but what's it been like for you to grow? Like, cause you're going strong. You've come from suspicious observers where you're kind of going around in that mobile unit and you're doing all your sun weather news, but now you have kind of grown. You've stood the test of time here. You've been on some pretty famous shows. People are respecting your work. What's that journey been like just from in the last decade?
Wow, what an expansive question.
Yes, right.
It's been a journey. There have been a lot of ups and a lot of downs. I would say that the stuff that I do that people see, the content creation, the books, the videos, things like that, that's pretty much been the only thing that has steadily been moving in a positive direction. Everything else is like a bit of a roller coaster. Obviously 2020 through 2023, the great weirding of the world was no fun for anybody. The number of professors, NASA scientists, things like that I end up chatting with on a weekly basis is about tripled in the last decade. That's a positive thing. Had some trouble in my home life, which has been fairly well publicized, but that has settled quite a bit, and that's led to other interesting opportunities. Yeah, it's been a whirlwind. Just
no pun intended.
Yeah, no kidding. My 8th book.
It's been a scorcher.
Yeah, the 8th book has just been finished. Pre-orders just stopped for that one. As you mentioned, we opened Observer Ranch at the start of the year. Ramping up any business is always a pain. You want it to be ramped up like that on day one. But it's been an interesting first season, getting our feet wet, learning how exactly to run a combination RV park, campground, and education center where we put on the science conferences and things like that. So we feel like we've learned a lot. We've survived so far, and getting ready for the warmth in America to be gone here in several weeks, and we start heading towards winter again.
Yeah. The other thing that's so popular now is the Cataclysm. I mean, this is like, this is something that I don't know if we're just in a bubble and we're hearing it more, but more and more people are talking about this upcoming Cataclysm, and you've been kind of like leading towards this for a long time. I mean, that must be weird for you to see it become so popular as well.
It has been weird, and I can tell you what really sort of made it click to me that this thing now had legs of its own. So it was late 2018 when I discovered the Adam and Eve story by Chan Thomas in the unsealed FBI files. Pretty much everyone that you've seen talk about that, got it from that starting point of me sharing that. As far as I can tell, there was nothing on the internet about it before that. But starting about maybe 2 years ago, I started to get messages from people saying, "Hey, Ben, you talk about this stuff all the time. Have you ever heard of the Adam and Eve story?" And, the initial reaction is, you heard about it because I found it. But in general, what it is it means that people are taking this and running with it, and it's got legs of its own. It's not just based on me trying to cram these things down people's throats. People are taking it and running with it, and I think that's a great thing. It does come with
running into some other stuff too, right? Like it's kind of at this nexus where it's really running into Randall's work, and it runs into this lost civilization stuff, and it seems like all that stuff is sort of like coming to a head right now.
Oh, definitely. I haven't spoken with Randall in a couple of years. I talk to Jimmy Corsetti from Bright Insight fairly regularly, about once a month. That's been helpful. But to be honest, the most helpful people who are into this, nobody knows their names. And it would be those dozens of professors, NASA scientists, people at the USGS and other things like that who have to remain anonymous because, they're on the inside, and they probably, I don't know if they're expressly forbidden from emailing me and telling me some of the things that they tell me, but they might be. And it's really nice having this many people on the inside to, just shoot me an email here. They're like, hey, Ben, make sure you check out the latest reviews in geophysics issue. There's something in there you need to see. Or, hey, Ben, I know you don't spend too much time looking at the electron data from this specific satellite, but go take a look at what happened from this day to this day. Having those people on the inside basically feeding stuff to me is really, really helpful. And it's because they have the same kind of frustrations that I have, where they opened their mind a little bit, decided, hey, I'm going to take a look at this information and see what I think of it. And they realized, oof, it's relatively bulletproof. We've got a disaster about to happen on this planet. And, their department heads don't want to hear about it. Their colleagues down the hall in their departments don't want to hear about it. And so they're like, what do we do? What do we do? All right, well, let's find who does want to hear about it, who is talking about this, who does have the freedom to actually, say whatever they feel like, who doesn't need to read a script, who doesn't have to wear a muzzle. Let's see how we can get this information out. And I've been shocked at how many people who have a lot to lose. I mean, you've got a $900,000 contract with NASA. You've got a lot to lose. Even if you've got tenure at a university, you can lose it. And so it's amazing, these people who are being cautious, but at the same time, these are the experts, and they are taking a risk to try to help all of us. And, if I wasn't just turning around and handing this information out to the masses, they'd probably stop giving it to me, because that's what they want. They want everybody knowing what's about to happen, even if they can't come out themselves and really say it.
So what is about to happen?
It's hard not to ask that right away.
Yeah, because just for the people, because there's probably some people here that haven't been following, and they're like, what are these guys talking about?
Absolutely. Well, the simplest word for it is a magnetic pole shift. This is very different than what is recorded on the crustal lines in the mid-Atlantic ridge. We have one kind of a magnetic reversal that only happens every few 100,000 years, and they call those long Cron magnetic reversals. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is what they playfully refer to as the rapid flips, the very, very short-lived and much more frequent geomagnetic excursions, or mini magnetic pole flips. Those happen about every 6,000 years. The last one was about 6,000 years ago. The one before that about 12,000 years ago. 18,000, 24,000, 30, 36, 42, 48. The cycle's pretty darn good. And you actually have to go back, more than 50,000 years before some of the data is a little harder to see. But even beyond that, the ones they do identify further back in time, 72,000 years ago, 106,000 years ago. If you keep the 6,000 year thing going, it hits these marks perfectly. And basically, every 6,000 years, we have a major change in Earth's magnetic field. It causes a major amount of climate change. It causes a volcanic and earthquake uptick. And they notice that these are the events where the majority of species seem to disappear if they're going to disappear. And just a quick note on that, so we understand what I mean. There's approximately 14 million known species on the planet. They estimate there could be as many as double that they don't know. And they think that probably 1 or 2 species goes extinct about every single day. Now, in the overall scheme of things, this doesn't really make that much of a difference because there's, on average, a species or 2 that, mutates and comes into being every day. But we go through these periods where maybe that 1 to 2 becomes 30, becomes 60, becomes 100 species. Now, the worst event that we have ever seen among these rapid flips was about 40-something thousand years ago, called Le Champ. About 3 or 4% of the species we know about disappeared. Now, that's obviously not the end of life on Earth, but that is an enormous number. Even though, people hear 3 to 4%, they're like, oh, that's a tiny little. When we're talking about species on the planet completely disappearing, that's huge. And for the species that didn't die out, that didn't go extinct, anywhere from a 20% to an 80% reduction in the population of those species. So we're talking about a major hit to what they call the biosphere, basically the life on Earth, whether that's birds in the sky, things here on the ground, or marine creatures that live in the water. We are coming up on this event once again. Like I mentioned before, it's perfectly due in time for this 6,000-year cycle. It's about time. It's been 6,000 years. Not only is it the perfect time, but everything we would be expecting to see if it were about to happen again, we are seeing. And we're seeing them accelerate. And so the magnetic poles have already begun to shift. I imagine some of your followers have probably heard about this, that the magnetic poles are actually starting to move, and that's going faster and faster and faster. Coming along with this, and this is what actually makes these so dangerous, the magnetic protection of our planet is weakening. Now, we have more than just an atmosphere, around our planet. We have a magnetic bubble. If the atmosphere is, just right, touching the surface and kind of locked to it, you come out a little bit and there's this magnetic shell acting like a force field of protection. And because all of the scary stuff from space, whether that's solar flare X-rays or plasma from a solar eruption or gamma rays or supernova energy, things like that, all of those things are electromagnetic, which means our magnetic shield helps deflect it and protect our planet. During these rapid geomagnetic excursions, these rapid magnetic pole flips, as that protection weakens, we get more of that space energy coming into Earth, and that has a dramatic effect on almost everything.
Can you give us some examples?
Absolutely. So, clouds, their formation, how big they get, how much water they hold, how much water they release, what their electric fields look like in terms of lightning, in terms of their spin, when we're talking about tropical storms, hurricanes, typhoons, cyclones, things like that. Tornado outbreaks have been linked to this electromagnetic energy coming in, how hot it is, how bad is the blizzard, how many hurricanes do you have that year, do you have an extended period of drought, how much rain is falling per hour. All of these things can be modulated by this electromagnetic energy coming in. And they actually accidentally proved this about 2 years ago. I don't know if you guys heard about the cloud seeding story out of the UAE. It actually came out of Dubai.
Is that where they made it rain too much?
Well, they did, but they actually dropped the majority of the rain further away. And so if they hadn't done that, it may have actually hit the populated area worse than it did. But it was a pretty bad event. It was going to be bad no matter what. But essentially, whereas most cloud seeding is either spraying water vapor or salting the clouds with, barium salts. We're talking about a completely different thing from chemtrails, which are much higher up, and that's oxidized nanometal particles, and that's usually done in the stratosphere. But when we're talking about cloud seeding, the UAE tried something different. They tried electric discharges from airplanes. So basically, they had these canisters that would basically just spark out electromagnetic particles and actually put electricity directly into the clouds. And they were figuring, hey, this can work as well. And so
does that work by, does that like static electricity would attract water vapor?
Kind of, but it also helps the water vapor attract to dust, and it helps that those combined molecules touch another one and actually form the cloud. They can actually start the cloud burst where the rain actually begins to come down from the cloud, etc. It's not like a cloud starts to form and the rain happens right away. There's a critical threshold that's hit, and then the cloud bursts and we get the rain. A lot of that can be triggered by electromagnetic forces too. So they actually accidentally proved how all of this affects the clouds. And when you're talking about affecting the clouds, a cloudy day versus a sunny day, that determines what the temperature is. The characteristics of the cloud determine how much rain or snow is going to come out of it, what the lightning is going to look like, and how long lasting the storm is. This is a lot of things that are very important for our daily lives, and we haven't even left weather yet. But of course, the reason why this affects weather so much is because of the electromagnetic nature of water and the electrostatic potential when we're talking about dust, which the water has to cling on to form the cloud. But let's think about this, because we're talking about electromagnetic energy. Obviously, water's a big one, but you know what else is big? Metals, like iron and all the metals that are in the crust. Not to mention the fact that there's electromagnetically reactive crystal in the crust, and a lot of it, a lot more than people realize. In fact, the number one constituent of the crust is a crystal called olivine. Now, what this means is that the vast majority of the stuff beneath our feet is equally or more reactive, in the case of iron, to this electromagnetic energy that is now penetrating to a greater degree. This is why we are going to be seeing a continued increase in seismic activity. When we talk about magma chambers, the viscosity oftentimes determines whether or not it roils and boils and slowly bubbles up and spills out, or whether there's an explosive volcanic eruption. And that viscosity is directly changed by electromagnetic features and input as well. And so just from the weather, just from earthquakes, just from volcanoes, this really begins to change our environment. And anytime you get a rapid and severe change in environment, it's difficult on the life that lives here. But let's think about this, because we're talking about electromagnetic energy, right? What else does this do? Because we're talking about its effect on the clouds, its effect on fault lines and magma chambers below. Hello, we're standing right in the middle of both of those things, and we're affected in two different ways. First of all, this electromagnetic energy is not great for our bodies. They noticed that all cardiovascular diseases, all psychological diseases, all autoimmune diseases, and even small little physiological characteristics like blood pressure, heart rate, all of these things can be affected by this electromagnetic energy from the sun. And they've done lots of studies. In fact, in today's show that I put out on YouTube, there was another study, probably the 400 or 500th one, saying respiratory deaths go up during a solar storm. Cardiovascular deaths go up during a solar storm. But also on the psychological side, suicides and murders go up during a solar storm. And there's been tons of studies about spikes in crime, like major crime waves associated with these solar storms as well. And so from a physiological and a psychological perspective, it's not so great for our bodies. But that's not the only part of it, because on its way down to the clouds and us and the ground and the magma chambers, it's got to go through the ozone layer. Now, normally, The ozone layer is in a nice balance. So if you were to go up and you could somehow sample parts of the ozone up at the top of the sky, and you could somehow, see how old those molecules were, none of them would be very old. The vast majority of the ozone that is up there right now was not there a year ago. It is a constantly replenishing thing. And normally there's a balance. The ultraviolet light from the sun causes a photochemical reaction that creates ozone. But the electrons and the protons, the particles, so we're not talking about UV light, now we're talking about particle energy, those break that molecule apart. And so there's usually this balance back and forth. But as Earth's magnetic field weakens, it maybe lets in 1 to 2% more light, but 60 to 200% more particles. That tips the scale when it comes to the ozone. And the particles are coming in much, much more. Ozone gets degraded. That lets in more ultraviolet light in the UVB and UVC range, which is directly impactful for skin, hair, fur, flowers, leaves, insects, some of the microbial life that's really important for the ocean, like phytoplankton, things like that, chlorophyll production, things like that. And so there's all these different ways it's affecting the climate. And then there's a double dose of electromagnetic radiation impact on life, on cells themselves, all while earthquakes and volcanoes are going off the charts. As if that's not bad enough, don't forget the magnetic poles are moving. And it's not just birds who use that for migration. Mammals use it for foraging and finding reproductive zones. So do about half of all marine creatures, hundreds of fish species, whales, sharks, turtles, crabs, other crustaceans as well. Lizards use it, amphibians, reptiles. All insects are reactive to this as well. And so while you have the climate going crazy, while you have an extra radiation impact to cells, and while you have earthquakes and volcanoes going off, half of the entire food chain has no idea where the heck it's supposed to be going. This is why, even though these events don't last very long, they're rapid ones. They can last anywhere from a few years to maybe a century at most. That's why they see these surges of extinctions, because you throw all of those different challenges at the biosphere at the exact same time, you're going to have species disappear. You're going to have other species really reduce their population, where it's like only the very strongest and most adaptable are going to make it through that kind of thing. And that's what we are moving towards right now. We are seeing the signs already. We already mentioned it's perfect time, and we're seeing the signs. This is what's coming when we cross a critical threshold, which will probably be at some point in the next decade, with the worst of the events probably being within 15 to 20 years.
What are sort of the geological implications? What is the difference in those depending on whether it was, say, a 5-year sort of thing or a 100-year thing? Is it worse if it's longer? Is it easier to ride out if it's longer?
Well, so that's an interesting question, because they do not notice. Remember the other kind of magnetic pole shift I talked about that only happens every couple 100,000 years. That can take 1,000 years to unfold. And when it takes 1,000 years to unfold, for any given creature, the change during their lifespan is not that great. And so they don't actually notice these major hits to the biosphere during the other kind of magnetic reversals. It's only when you get that all of this stuff happening, but it's compacted into a really confined period of time, where instead of, dozens to maybe hundreds of generations, depending on what species you're talking about, we're talking about a generation or two. And they've got to deal with all of it, all combined, right, like that. Essentially, we do absolutely have the slow crawl of wind and water and geology. It's just that it's punctuated every few thousand years by an absolute cataclysm. And we see things like these surge deposits from the massive tsunamis that occur. Like, a lot of people are familiar with the boneyards up in Alaska. That's an excellent example. There's another one at the bottom of the Gulf of America that, you know, can't exactly be explored as well as the one up in Alaska, but we know it's down there.
There's some up in the caves in Scotland, I think,
Absolutely.
too, right?
Absolutely.
They just found like stuff that should have never ended up there and barely even could fit through the door, and it's all crammed in there on top of each other and in different epochs.
Exactly right. There's a couple in the on both sides of the Indian subcontinent in the Indian Ocean, like where it, you know, it ran off and ran down into the water like that. China's got several, you know, basically on the edge of their mountain range. There are actually some that they're largely destroyed, but when they were looking at some of the lava flows and some of the volcanoes from Africa, like from Congo over to the East African Rift, they noticed that lava flows had covered up what appear to be some of those surge deposits as well. They're pretty much all over the world. And that's actually one of the things that Chan Thomas in his book, Adam and Eve Story, covered pretty well. And these are, you know, one of the scarier aspects of it, because you take a look at some of the sediment that is along with the trees and the bones and the muck and everything else, and you realize these tsunamis are basically sweeping over entire continents. We're talking about Hollywood movie level stuff here. And so it's a good thing it doesn't last very long, because the planet wouldn't be a very nice place to live in general if this was how Earth operated on a regular basis. The good news is it's kind of like a hellish cosmic Super Bowl. And if you can just get through it, things kind of go back to normal. Everybody goes to Disneyland.
You mentioned Chan Thomas, and you have Hapgood and Velikovsky sort of around those 50s and 60s. This isn't such a far out idea. It seems to be. I mean, I'm in the middle of narrating Hapgood's book right now, and it's, you know, it's cited, or, you know, and I don't think he's got everything right, but the amount of like.
Are you familiar with my opinion on Hapgood?
Yeah. And that's why I said, but, you know, well, why don't we share that?
Sure. So I guess in order to do that, we have to go back to Major White, because the story doesn't make sense without Major White and Project Nanook. So it's the 40s, and the Cold War is, you know, starting to become what people are scared about, because World War II is fading away. And the US government is worried that Russia is going to come over the top. You know, they're not worried about them flying over the Pacific or flying over Europe. They're worried about Russia going right over the North Pole and coming and attacking America. So they sent Major Maynard E. White up to the far Canadian Arctic to begin setting up bases, learn how to do Arctic warfare, all these other things. Now, the first thing they realized when they were, you know, flying planes in, they were realizing, okay, we're on this heading, and then we look down 30 seconds later, and north is behind us. And they realized, okay, wait, first thing we have to do is we have to find the magnetic pole so we can learn how to freaking navigate up here. While they are doing that, that's when they discovered that the magnetic pole is moving over time. That's when they dug down into the sediment there and found the layers where, you know, the top layer is polar fossils, as would be expected, but the next layer is only tropical, polar, tropical, polar, tropical. And it was the data from that mission and the Pentagon meetings, which were run by the RAND Corporation and the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which morphed into the CIA. So the OSS was the predecessor organization to the CIA. It was their finding that during these magnetic pole shifts, something causes the Earth to tilt 90 degrees. This is what causes the great tsunamis. This is why they find layers of polar, tropical, because it tilts 90 degrees and then it goes back. And then it tilts 90 degrees and then it goes back. That was the official pre-CIA Pentagon conclusion, that when these magnetic pole shifts happen, the Earth tilts over like this, tilts 90 degrees. It happens in just one day. It causes the great tsunamis. It causes that different layering they see in the polar region. And the top geophysicist for the OSS at that time was Charles Hapgood. But wait a minute. 20 years later, he's just some random professor, and he's advocating for 7 degrees of tilt that takes 1,000 years. Well, what happened in between when he was leading the science team that said one day, 90-degree flip, to 1,000 years for 7 degrees? The answer is not that he got some new information or he changed his mind. The answer is you never stop working for the CIA or the OSS in this case. They had already classified everything from Project Nanook that could possibly lead people to these conclusions. They were already funneling money through the National Science Foundation to write debunking studies of this kinds of thing. But the very last thing they had to do, they ordered, and I'm almost positive that this is how it went down. They ordered Charles Hapgood put out a completely nonsense version of this so that we can easily debunk it and we can just call this stuff pseudoscience and no real scientist will take it seriously ever again. And it almost worked. It did work for several decades, but there's no way that the same guy who was like, nope, you've got 90-degree tilt in one day, 20 years later is randomly advocating for 1,000 years to tilt 7 degrees. It's nonsensical. It doesn't explain any of the evidence. 1,000 years for a 7-degree tilt doesn't get you the tsunamis. A 7-degree tilt doesn't get you the alternate layering, polar, tropical.
Yeah,
polar,
and the interesting thing is the evidence is in the book. So you're reading the book and it doesn't explain even the evidence that he's citing in the book.
Exactly. And so I'm almost positive that his whole purpose was to discredit this science entirely. Now, luckily for us, Major White committed treason, but in the best way possible. He kept everything, and he gave it to his son, Ken White, to publish in the book World in Peril at some point in the early 90s, I think. And so it's important that that happened, because without that, we might not know any better. The other important thing is they discovered those mammoths frozen in the Arctic with food undigested in their mouths and their stomachs, right? Everybody's heard of the mammoths, but nobody asks the right question. Everybody's like, how do you freeze a mammoth so fast that that chemical digestion stops, just instantly stops? And that's not an uninteresting question, but the better question is, what were they eating? And here's why. They found these things up here, right? They found them in the Arctic Circle. They had to dig them out of 20 to 30 feet of ice, right? We are 12,000 years into a hot interglacial period. These creatures were frozen in the glacial period when it was 10, 20 degrees colder than it is now. If there's 20 to 30 feet of ice there now, 12,000 years into a hot interglacial, it's not like there was a bunch of vegetation growing there in the glacial cycle at the polar region when it was 20 degrees colder. Those things needed to eat 1,000 pounds or more of vegetation a day. The only answer is the Earth was like this. They were eating at mid and low latitude, and then it tilted 90 degrees and they froze instantly, because otherwise there would have been nothing for those massive creatures to eat in the Arctic back in the glacial cycle. Hell, there's nothing for them to eat now. And if it was
the other thing is it gives you a real good head start on an ice sheet. If you have the thing flip, so you have this crazy tsunami that's like say if you have Canada moving north, you'll have all this water coming in from the north, and then you're at the North Pole and it's, 30, 40, 50 degrees colder.
Right.
So, but isn't there an argument to be made that they knew about this even before Hapgood? I mean, Donnelly was talking about cataclysms, Ragnarok, the age of fire and gravel. They knew about some of the Arctic stuff, that it was a different climate up there. They knew about sort of like this mud flood cataclysm.
They did, but they weren't really able. I mean, unless you want to talk about,
I mean, I was watching a thing on the Scary Interesting YouTube channel last night about these first missions from the Americans in like the late 1800s, when they were trying to, it was the Greeley one where they ended up eating each other. But already in the 1800s, for some reason they were gung-ho to get as far north as they could and set up these research stations.
Well, so they had access, so they probably knew a lot more about this when from some of the British sailors. British sailors had been using compasses and been doing detailed magnetic measurements, based on, okay, we are here. We know we are here. This is the magnetic vector towards the North Pole. They'd show up 2 years later and they'd know they were in the exact same spot. And then they'd check and they'd be like, wait a minute, this is now 1 degree off. Let's come back in 2 more years, another 1 or 2 degrees off. And so they've actually known about this for a very, very long time. How much they've known, that's interesting. One could guess, based on the documents that Major White kept from Project Nanook and from the Pentagon meetings, that they didn't put it all together until the late 40s or early 50s. I think there's a good chance that they put it together before that. But here's the thing. Even right before he died, Einstein still didn't have it all together. Now, you might ask how I could possibly know that. Well, if you've ever heard of a group called the Thunderbolts Project, they're very into something called the electric universe theory.
Yep.
I think that there's some merit in some of the things they say. Some of the things they say are complete nonsense, and some of the best things they say, they merely just stole from Anthony Peratt and Hannes Fain in plasma cosmology. But nevertheless, I got to know that group very well about 10 to 13 years ago. And the one of them that I sort of latched on to the most was a guy named Michael Steinbacher. He did the electric geology stuff. And it turns out Michael Steinbacher was Immanuel Velikovsky's favorite Thunderbolt. They interacted with Velikovsky quite a bit. In fact, I've heard several stories about Dave Talbot and Wal Thornhill talking to Immanuel Velikovsky, and Velikovsky's like, where are you getting this Saturn stuff? And they're like, well, it kind of has to be this. But apparently that was their big disagreement. But Velikovsky's favorite Thunderbolt was Michael Steinbacher. Before Einstein died, Einstein and Velikovsky were mailing each other letters about the disaster cycle. I don't know if you've ever seen that one interview with Velikovsky where he's talking about, perhaps the Earth turned over. We are on an accident-prone planet. Major solar flares can change the rotation of the Earth. And we know that Einstein wrote the foreword for Hapgood's book several years before he died. And so it's not surprising that these two were talking to one another. Well, in Velikovsky's will, he willed Michael Steinbacher a bunch of those letters from Einstein. And in the months before Steinbacher died, I was visiting with him in California. I got to read every single one of them.
Wow.
Einstein was what he says in the foreword is absolutely true. He was 100% convinced the Earth turns over. There's a major crustal displacement causing major tsunamis, causing all kinds of bad stuff. But he couldn't figure out how you actually did it. Like he's like, there's more than enough evidence to suggest that it happens. But how is it happening? At no point in any of these letters does he talk about Earth's magnetic field. He doesn't talk about the sun. He doesn't talk about solar system or galactic scale magnetic fields or anything like that, the stuff that we have lots of information about now, in which we can easily put the picture together, Einstein didn't have access to any of that. And so he kind of died frustrated by this one point where he couldn't figure out how to explain all of this evidence, which he knew must be real from a mechanistic standpoint. You know, the pattern was there, but he couldn't figure out the mechanics, how it actually all fit together and how it all worked.
Does it always go the same direction? Like, is it a 90 and then back, or is it kind of, you never really
90
know?
and then back, and then 90 and then back, at least for the last 4 or 5. And I mean,
that pairs well with the stuff the ethical skeptic is doing. I mean, which would lead into the, like, did the ancients know? Do you think there's evidence that the ancients, I mean, we mentioned Jimmy Corsetti, Göbekli Tepe is intentionally buried. It seems to be things. Ethical skeptics' interpretation of Pillar 43 seems to show that they were talking about it, and maybe that's why they stopped excavating the place.
Yeah, I think that it really blows open archaeology in the history of our species to let us really find out everything about Göbekli Tepe, which is why they are trying their hardest to stop that from happening. I think that human civilization has probably risen and fallen a couple of times at least on this planet. And, you know, the sad truth of it is, you know, every piece of metal that we have made as a modern species, it's going to have rusted away to nothing in about 1,000 years or 2 at most. So you try to look back 6,000, 12,000 years for evidence. What do you have? The only thing that's left are the stone structures. Just like 6,000 years from now, the only things that are still going to be here are those megaliths from the past, the pyramids, and Mount Rushmore. Nothing else from this time will still be here. It'll all be gone. And that makes it really hard to actually know.
You think Hapgood thought it was probably best that we didn't tell humans? I mean, maybe humanity wasn't ready for like the cyclical awareness, you know? I mean, they could have just decided back then in the 40s, like, we cannot tell everybody about this.
Well, could you imagine what would happen? I mean, so look, I'm sure you guys have seen the movie 2012. Apart from the disaster itself, the closest thing there is to a bad guy in that movie is the heavy set government guy, right? But he says the most intelligent thing anybody says in that entire film. Do you remember what he said? He said, "What? You just want to tell everyone they're doomed? There'll be anarchy, chaos. They'll destroy any hope we have of saving anybody." And, you know, I do believe this. For every black hat elite up at the top who just hates us and wants us all dead, they want depopulation, there's probably a white hat opposite them up there as well who thinks they're Batman, believes in karma, or is just a good person. Not everybody up at the top is some evil thing. And so we have, what's the best way to put this? Whether you hate people and you want depopulation, or whether you want to save as many as possible, the only smart thing to do is to shut the hell up.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I was thinking about that with the black budget spending and stuff too. Before we did this interview, I was thinking back to our show with Douglas Vogt, and I know you're aware of Douglas Vogt and his work. And he thought that the American government knew about his research that in 2046 it was going to happen, or is it 2040? Now I always get that in the Phoenix event. No, 20. You know, but he said that Trump in his first term, they authorized, like, I don't know, like, I mean, $1 trillion, is that enough to feed 5 billion people for a year? Like, he said that they built these underground bunkers, you know, and part of me, there's a sympathetic part of me that's like, maybe they were paying attention to all this and they were really trying to do something to save humanity. I mean, whether who gets chosen or not, I don't know, it's a whole different issue, but maybe they're spending trillions of dollars of these black project stuff on trying to build the infrastructure to save humanity. I mean,
it makes
sense. The other thing is, if you get through with the tech, you win. I mean, you're the new ruler of the planet.
Yeah. Now, I don't think any tech is going to make it through, because the The induction goes all the way to the core. Everything circuitry related is gonna melt. But you can certainly hide from the worst parts of the disaster. And here's something I figured out. If you just look at the acknowledged underground bases and underground tunnels, you could fit millions of people in them. Think about what they've got that we don't know about, that isn't acknowledged. And so they're clearly building an enormous complex. They're doing an enormous amount of preparation to the point where if they were just planning on letting the elites hide in there, they would have been done years ago.
Yeah, that's what
It
I'm
Well, there's a huge, like, if you're using your head, you know, there's a huge, like, inbreeding, you know, you got to really think it through. Otherwise, what's the point?
Well,
of
I mean, and here's the thing. It doesn't necessarily mean that they love us and they want to protect us. Maybe they